From Wakefield, it's the Nolan Night Show, inviting you to join Nolan as guest this week for the 90th episode of the podcast, David Leaf to the show. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's Nolan.
And welcome back to another edition of the program. As my guest and I sit down virtually to record this, I'm pleased that we have reached another milestone edition of the podcast, being number 90. It's been my absolute pleasure, to do this. I didn't think I would last this long, but here we are, full steam ahead. And who better to have on than my guest for this amazing episode? I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you enjoyed the previous ones. Now, as I said, we reached this milestone episode. Who better to have on as our guest, as he is reaching 2 weeks before his global release of his book. Based out of Southern California, his work has been seen on every major broadcast network. He has collaborated and created work on the likes of the Bee Gees, the families of John Lennon, James Brown, the Brothers Marx, Peter Sellers, Jonathan Winters, and of course, my favorite and his favorite, Brian Douglas Wilson. When he's not behind a camera or winning awards for his written work, he can be found at UCLA teaching the next hopeful generation of songwriters, historians, and filmmakers. I am pleased to have David Leaf on the podcast for the aforementioned 90th episode to talk about his new book, an expanded and updated version of the Beach Boys and the California Myth, now titled God Only Knows, Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys and the California Myth. David, it's a pleasure to have this time with you today.
Thank you, Nolan. It's great to be here. That was an amazing introduction, especially as you referred to them as the Brothers Marx.
Yes.
I love that. I can see behind you, you have some of my favorite people of all time. I teach a course in the Beatles.
Yeah.
The Sopranos was obviously one of the greatest television shows of all times. And Goodfellas, it makes me wish I could have a slice or two of pizza while we're doing the show.
As I've talked about with all my guests, and it's sort of just present there. Brian had his tour rescheduled, and as did all other musicians, because of these wild and crazy times that we find ourselves in. And you wrote your book and finished your book during these times. So besides the book, or maybe including the book, how's life been for you now to be able to look at this point forward?
Well, the book is really thrilling for me because it's been out of print for over 35 years. And I ran out of copies a long time ago, long before you were born. So I couldn't even if somebody was like a great friend and they wanted a copy, I didn't have one to give to them. So I'm thrilled to get it back in print. Curiously, as a writer, as a professor, as a filmmaker, the being at home in front of a laptop is kind of what I'm used to doing.
Sure.
So life is inside my bubble is great. We won't go down the rabbit hole of the world.
Sure.
But writing about Brian Wilson and the music that he created with the Beach Boys and after he left the group to go on his solo career, it seems to be my greatest passion as a creator. I first wrote about Brian when I was in college. I wrote reviews of the Surf's Up and Holland albums for my college newspaper. I started a magazine called Pet Sounds when I moved to California from New York. My book, the original edition of the Beach Boys and the California Myth, came out in 1978.
Wow.
I've known him. I met him in '76, and we've been friends for well over 40 years. So it's really exciting to have had a chance to sit down without really any pressure,
Sure,
other than the deadline from my publisher, and revisit what Brian's accomplished since the last edition. Because the first edition and the update that came out in '85, neither of those books ended on a happy note.
Yeah.
They were really sad / depressing / almost hopeless. And now we can look back from 2022 at this remarkable amount of work he's done since then, the amazing tours he's done, his first solo tours, the Pet Sounds tours, him, the Brian Wilson Presents Smile, That Lucky Old Son, Gershwin, and on and on and on. It's just been an amazing experience to have lived through.
Speaking
now to write about my memories and share it.
In other interviews you've done, whether it be with Giggins or other people or Beach Boys Talk, you talked about, besides maybe being a fan of the Beatles and maybe a record or two of theirs, maybe Neil Sedaka's greatest hits. You weren't really maybe a commercial buyer and record collector prior to going to college at George Washington.
I wasn't an album buyer. Other than the Beatles, and I bought singles. I bought lots of singles. Well, I don't know, I had 100 or so singles. The radio played the songs you loved so much. Top 40 radio was just kind of this endless loop. So they had their playlist. In New York specifically, it was more like a top 20 playlist. So if you think of you in the course of a couple of hours, you would hear your favorite songs over and over again. So you didn't really need to buy the records that much. But yeah, so college is where my musical horizons narrowed from, okay, the Beatles to there's this incredible world of music. I mean, I think in just like the first week of college, I heard Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues. I heard the first Crosby, Stills and Nash album. I heard James Taylor's first album. I mean, it's just like, and 10 others that are still important to me. So there was this explosion that had been going on. It finally reached me. I was a late arrival, so to speak.
There were two instances in the beginning of the book where you talk about, or maybe even in interviews you've also done, where you talked about the Beach Boys concert you went to in high school, part of your bowling team, and then when you went with your RA at GW to the concert and what that meant to you. And I found it funny that the first time you saw them, you thought it was an intermission because you'd been to Broadway shows and then the show was over. At that point, how important were those concerts to you in terms of getting to LA to then write your book about Brian and help him with Smile?
So the first time I saw the Beach Boys, Thanksgiving Eve of 1967, it was the first rock concert I'd ever been to. And the key moment of that night really was kind of this positive mass hysteria, the experience of hearing live a hit that you were in love with at the moment it was a hit. Not a show where you're looking at, where you're going to legacy acts and you're hearing them do songs from 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Sure.
But to hear the Strawberry Alarm Clock do Incense and Peppermints and the Soul Survivors do Expressway to Your Hearts and the entire Beach Boys set was hits. So that was exciting, but it had nothing to do with me becoming a writer about the Beach Boys. It was just, this was a great experience. That's all it was. The concert I went to in the fall of 1971 was part of this kind of, it was three things happened in the fall of 71 that made me a fanatic, if you will. It was reading this article in Rolling Stone about Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys and the Smile album. It was buying and listening to endlessly the album Surf's Up that the article was promoting, especially the title song, which was from Smile, and the song that just preceded it, a song called Till I Die. And what happened with those songs was, with Surf's Up, it was, oh my God, Smile is as great as this article says. And Till I Die told me he could still do it.
Yeah.
So when I went to see the Beach Boys and heard them recreating on stage Surf's Up and other songs of that era, as well as their greatest hits, it was impressive. And it was actually the night, as I mentioned in the book, where I met my first Beach Boy.
Yeah.
But it was really reading Brian's story and hearing the music and then delving back into the Beach Boys discography, that very early on, after those events happened, in late 71, early 72, I said to my roommate something like, I'm going to move to California, write a book about Brian Wilson, become his friend, and help him finish Smile. I mean, it is funny. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, it's like somebody saying, when I grow up, I'm going to be president.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just as absurd a notion.
Sure.
But yet again, somebody does grow up to be president. And so, but it laid out in very simple terms a dream. Now, I had a lot of other dreams as well.
Sure.
I wanted to be a writer on situation comedies. I wanted to be a sportscaster. I did a lot of things that I did, but nothing meant as much to me as writing about Brian, and in a sense, I wanted to grab the world by the shirt collar and kind of shake them with the book and say,
Sure.
do you understand how important this guy is?
Yeah.
This guy is really a big deal. Why are you not paying
Sure.
attention to him?
Well, I marvel. I'm kind of jealous that you were able to be there for the moment of the Beach Boys when they probably were their most creative in the early 70s with Surf's Up and Sunflower. As a fan, though, and maybe from your perspective, because you talk about it in the book where the Beach Boys had a lot of moments of flashes of brilliance, but then moments where they didn't go through with their plans. You see Surf's Up, Sunflower, great albums. As a fan, did you hope that that was the direction they would take? Because you mentioned Till I Die was a high class version of In My Room. Your thoughts of that music then, but also where they would end up from there.
Well, as I wrote in the first edition and in the update, after the Holland album, there was a lot of disappointment.
Yeah.
We were hoping it was kind of a group of fans and friends who were following them, and we were hoping the next album would be great. And after Surf's Up, Carl and the Passions wasn't great.
Yeah.
Holland had flashes of greatness, The Traitor, the title song, the little snippets of music on the fairy tale, Funky Pretty. But overall, it wasn't a start to finish great album.
Sure.
It didn't stand up to Sunflower, Surf's Up. And then after the Beach Boys kind of became a greatest hits act, their albums since then have been anywhere from B minus to D minus.
Yeah.
Depending upon your taste.
Yeah.
Ironically, the album they made a decade ago for their 50th anniversary was a pretty good album.
Yeah.
Much better than I think we had a right to expect. But you say you kind of envy the fact that I came along at that moment in 71 when they were when the Beach Boys, as opposed to Brian, were at their kind of creative peak. Interestingly, the more you learn about that era, meaning like the Feel Flows box set, you realize that they just couldn't get out of their own way.
Yeah.
When I interviewed Stephen Desper, the great engineer who was key to that, to the greatness of the music of that's on the Feel Flows box set, and you hear a story that Brian had done an original version of Till I Die, and you find out that the Beach Boys rejected it, that they thought it was too depressing a song to put on a Beach Boys album. And so Brian, okay, I'm going to write a new lyric, and the lyric he wrote is depressing enough. One can only imagine what the original lyric was. Dennis's song, Wouldn't It Be Nice? Wouldn't it be nice to be young again? Is that the title?
Yeah.
If that had ended side one of the Surf's Up album, what would that album have been
Sure.
like? So there were a lot of, people used to always ask me, why did the Beach Boys do this or why did they do that? And it kind of got tiring to answer the question because they just seemed to always make the wrong decisions.
Sure.
They didn't really have. I mean, if you go back to 1962, and so the Beatles are getting their first recording contract with EMI Records, the Parlophone label, and the Beach Boys are getting their first contract with Capitol Records, a subsidiary of EMI. 60 years ago, you're talking about anniversaries. Brian Epstein became the Beatles manager and Murray Wilson became the Beach Boys manager. And that may tell you all you need to know in terms of the Beach Boys were kind of a homemade, home-run operation. And the Beatles were reaching for the stars. They always were reaching for the stars. There's an amazing interview with Brian Epstein, with the radio journalist Larry Kane, where he says, and this is a clip you can see on the web, Larry, I believe that in the year 2000, people will be listening to the Beatles music and realize how great they are. There was nobody on the Beatles, there was nobody on the Beach Boys side doing that until they hired Derek Taylor, who had been the Beatles publicist. And he's the one who created the idea that Brian Wilson's genius. He's the one who came up with the public relations slogan. And it was Brian Wilson is a genius, ... I think. And the British press ate it up. And since 1966 in England, Brian has been a god.
Yeah.
But that didn't happen in the United States.
Yes. It's hard to imagine that and put that together for a group to, in their own country, to not be popular for many years in the late 60s and into some of the 70s, but then go overseas and they're beloved. And Pet Sounds used the Pet Sounds tour overseas, and it's always a great success over there. You mentioned the Pet Sounds fan magazine that you were working on. How much of that in that process did you think or know would connect you further down the line to be able to write a book about Brian and the group?
The answer is probably 100% and 0. When I started Pet Sounds, which in those days they called them a fanzine, so I guess it was like a paper podcast, if you will. It was a way for people who believed in, a small group of people. I never reached 1,000 subscribers. I think the first issue, I had 300 subscribers or something like that. But I started so that I could write what I wanted to write about Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. And it was an absolutely unbelievable series of events that led to me getting a book contract. The first issue came out in February of 1977. And a guy named Bob Merlis, who was the head of Warner Brothers Music Publicity for decades, great guy, great publicist. He had helped get me some interviews. He helped with all sorts of things. He made sure I got the advance cover for the Beach Boys' Love You to include in that issue. When he saw the first issue, he said, "Wow, this is really cool. Could I get 1,000 of these?" And it was like, yeah. And he sent them to every single rock critic on his mailing list. And one of them, a guy named Guy Trubet at the Village Voice in New York, got it and had never seen anything like it. And he did an article about it. And he interviewed me for the article. And it was because of that a book packaging company in New York named Delilah Books saw it and hired me to do research on one of their books. And when the author of that book, which was going to be called Sand Tracks, Growing Up with the Beach Boys, when he sold a miniseries, I convinced them to let me write the book. So there's amazing series of circumstances, and I didn't tell, there's another 20 minutes to the story, but so Pet Sounds led to the book. Without Pet Sounds, the book wouldn't have happened.
What I like about the book also is you mention as one section finishes, then you're starting the second or the update, and then the current version of the book. You reflect on what you wrote and what you could have done better at, but then also why what you wrote is what should have been there. How much of an effect maybe during the second section of the book, the update in 85, or then the third update or the second update, was affected by your relationship with Brian at that point?
Well, the 85 update certainly reflects my growing relationship with him and kind of the despair that I felt as I was watching his life go down the drain, essentially. He was in terrible shape, terrible shape. And so that's reflected in the update that came out in 85. is that the one I ended with, as my grandmother used to say, where there's life, there's hope. There was a period in the 1980s where if your viewers don't know this, Brian was under the control of a pseudo doctor who, for 9 years, had control of every aspect of Brian's life, every moment of Brian's life. And when it ended, when Brian referred back to it, he said it was like I was in prison for 9 years.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is during that time, if we think back to the 60s and how much of Brian's beautiful Beach Boys music came out of the emotions of young love, longing for a girl, wanting a girl, dreaming of a girl, relationships. I mean, Pet Sounds is essentially an emotional autobiography of Brian's love. In 1986, he met Melinda, his wife, now 30 years. So he was now writing again with kind of the teenage crush.
Sure.
And his 1988 album has some of his best songs of the solo career. So as horrible as that period was, Brian is a genius at many things. Survival is one of them. And his ability to thrive under the most difficult circumstances is astounding. So even though he was in prison, he found a way to make music that could reach us.
Well, besides Love and Mercy on his 88 album, there's many other gems on there, deep cuts on there that most regular people who know the Beach Boys music and Brian Wilson music don't know about. And it's a beautiful thing. As you mentioned, I sort of have to agree that even if he was in pain and tortured, that he was still able to create music regardless of that. As a writer, though, writing about that, and not specific incidents, but writing about that period in his life, how did you write about that and an ability to do it fully where you're not having to step back all the time and say, this is too much for me to write about at the moment?
Well, it's a great question. When I wrote the first book, the Beach Boys were breaking up. There always seems to be a crisis of one kind or another. In writing this book, I just wrote it. And then I looked at it and I said, are these stories too personal to include?
Sure.
Because there's a line between me writing about my adventures with Brian Wilson, and then there's I don't want to cross the line of, wait a second, I'm his friend. The only reason I experience those moments is because I'm his friend. So it's not for me to write about those things. And that was really where I wouldn't say I struggled, or where I gave a lot of thought to what should be included and what shouldn't be included. There are a couple of stories in particular that are in the book that I really like. Okay, should that be there? One in particular has to do with an event that happened during the making of Beautiful Dreamer, and it's in the movie. And Melinda tells the story about Brian going to the emergency room during the rehearsals, and that afterwards, she said, "You want to go out to dinner?" and we left. So I felt like that story, and then she also in the movie talks about how he was going downhill just before going to London, how nervous he was. So I felt I could write about that a little bit. And so what I added to that was when the four of us came out of the hospital and I was walking ahead of Melinda and my late wife, and Brian and I were a good 20 feet ahead, so they couldn't hear what we were saying. And I said to Brian, if finishing Smile is going to upset you this much, it's not worth doing.
Yeah.
Which was not an easy thing to say. And we're now in 2004. I'd been waiting 33 years to hear Smile.
Yeah.
But as his friend, I felt that was kind of like a put up or shut up moment.
Yeah.
because I was going to be critical of other people for how they might have exploited Brian, then I needed to not be a person like that. And I had to be, at that moment, I had to be his friend. I said, Brian, we won't make the movie. You don't have to go to London. None of that.
Yeah.
And he said, no, I have to do it, which is what he told Melinda that she said in the movie. His determination. He says it over and over again. He said it, I think, on the Mike Douglas talk show in 1976. My last name is Wilson, so I guess I have a lot of will.
Yeah. The last 30 years that you've known Brian, and maybe specifically the last 24 or so, dating back to the late 90s, you've played a big role in his resurgence as a solo artist, whether it be the All-Star Tribute Concert or the Smile and several other of the events that he did, the Roxy Theater show. For you to be part of that and help bring that part of Brian back into the world, what does that mean to you in terms of self-gratification, but also in a sense of your ability as a friend to Brian?
In terms of self-gratifying, it was spectacular. I mean, it was kind of like one dream come true after another.
Sure.
Although I didn't have anything to do with making the Roxy happen. I was there and I got to write the liner notes. But a lot of the things as a friend were like the first tours when Brian called and said, you got to come out here. I can't do this without you. I didn't do anything. I was there.
Yeah.
My late wife and I, we were there. That's what he wanted. When you are successful, and it doesn't matter what field you're successful in, there are people who are trying to figure out, how can I get a piece of that?
Sure.
How can I glom onto that? And in Brian's case, it's kind of been epidemic in terms of people, wanting a piece of Brian Wilson. And so if he has a friend, Ray, Jerry, myself, Danny Hutton, people who didn't want anything from him, people were just happy to hang out.
Yeah.
That meant a lot to him. And conversely, it meant a lot to me that we were just hanging out.
Sure.
So we wouldn't have been on those tours. I wouldn't have gone to Japan with him if not for him wanting me to be there. Again, I had no official role.
Sure.
I never worked for him as a manager, a PR agent, or anything like that. I never was in his employ. That was very important to Brian.
Sure.
Because people sooner or later go to work for him.
Yeah.
And that's, whether it's as a lyricist or whatever. And that's usually when the relationship starts to go sour, because now it's a boss-employee relationship. Sure. We're just friends. Yeah, you want to go to the Hawaiian swim. You want to go to the movies. You want to go out to dinner. I mean, it sounds surrealistic.
Sure.
We're walking from my apartment down the 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica to the movie theater and back. And on the way back, he's telling me, I need you to be there when I do Smile. What? So it's really been extremely meaningful in both of the ways you described.
Sure.
And the All-Star tribute was a giant payback.
Sure.
It's what can we do to honor this guy? And then I think you can tell by the people who were there: Paul Simon, Billy Joel, Elton John, Sir George Martin, David Crosby, Carly Simon, Jimmy Webb, and on and on and on. That's the regard that Brian Wilson is held in. That these people went out of their way to be there, as he said. He was stunned.
Yeah.
He really was.
Well, what I like about the All-Star Tribute show, two of my favorite performances besides the end, or three, I should say, my favorite three, where I think Billy Joel's performance of Don't Worry Baby, Paul Simon's Surfer Girl performance, I believe that was at that concert, and then the threesome version of Surf's Up with Jimmy Webb on piano, David Crosby, and why am I forgetting his name?
Vince Gill.
Vince Gill, yes. And the story Vince Gill shares about learning that he was being tested with singing some of the songs, some of Brian's toughest songs, is a funny one nonetheless. What I also chuckle about, and I didn't learn this until maybe watching other interviews you did, is Brian's television appearance in the late 80s on the new version of Leave It to Beaver as Mr. Hawthorne. Where does that rank for you in terms of the other things you had a role in his later career?
I would say that's fairly close to the bottom of the list in terms of importance or meaning. That was just, I was a staff writer on the new Leave It to Beaver. The executive producer, Brian Levant, who the writer and producer of the show as well, said, any chance we could get Brian to come in and be the teacher? And I asked, and it happened.
Yeah.
But it was a silly, if you go back to the Beach Boys' career, there they are in the Monkey's Uncle.
Yeah.
With Annette Funicello. It ranks just slightly above Living Doll, I would say.
It's an interesting clip, and I'll leave it at that based on Brian, where he was at that point. And in the 80s, it really touched my heart in your book, besides the other stuff I mentioned, is your homage and tribute to Dennis Wilson at the end of the 85 update and sort of his album and what that was like and sort of his path through life. He had probably one of the greatest albums, in my opinion, that he ever put out, being Pacific Ocean Blue. And it's better than I think most of the Beach Boys albums, in my opinion, as well, given the success that album had, not just briefly then, but also in 30 years later when it got all the awards in 2008. Would you have liked to have seen that direction taken by the Beach Boys back then?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if they had recorded the songs on Pacific Ocean Blue, they would have had a career worth talking about. I mean, there were two great songwriters in the Beach Boys, Brian and Dennis.
Yeah.
And Carl wrote some great songs, but he was not prolific.
Sure.
Dennis was pretty prolific.
Yeah.
You hear it on the Feel Flows box set. You hear it on the expanded edition of Pacific Ocean Blue. Dennis was undisciplined.
Yes.
And to have a career, that has to be your number one priority, your number two priority, your number three priority. So if after Pacific Ocean Blue had come out, he had gone out and done a tour, and then come back and done another album, and gone out and done another tour, and come back and done another album, that's how you build a career.
Sure.
I mean, you look at somebody like Billy Joel. Billy Joel was in a group called the Hassles, then he was in a group called Attila, then he did, I think, 3 solo albums without a hit. Well, that's certainly without a big hit before Piano Man. And so he was working at it for a long time.
Sure.
And Dennis, just, God love him,
Yeah.
he was a wild man.
Sure. How much, and you kind of answered it then, though, but how much of an effect, if let's say that was a success and he stayed on the straight path of life and gotten his stuff together, how much of an effect would that have had in terms of the Beach Boys' history today, in terms of a positive release back then?
It's a really interesting speculation. It's hard to know. Brian was really unhappy with the fact that Dennis, Carl, and Mike could do solo albums, but if he was working, it had to be Beach Boys.
Sure.
There's a short story in the update about the first time Carl played in his first solo album. Not a pretty story at all. So when Brian wanted to name an album Brian Loves You, they said, no, we're going to call it The Beach Boys Love You, even though it was primarily Brian's work. Same with Adult Child, which, why couldn't that have come out?
Yeah.
So as what happened in '67 with the Beach Boys, for whatever combination of circumstances, they didn't follow him down the Smile path.
Sure.
They didn't let him go down the Redwood / Three Dog Night path.
Sure.
So he was stymied. Now he couldn't help himself. He'd come out with great songs.
Yeah.
It just kept. It was like just nature for him.
Sure.
And every album would have you know, at least a couple. And then it stopped. If in '77, when the Beach Boys were imploding, if Dennis had been successful, and I could say, okay, I don't need to come back to the Beach Boys. And Carl had seen that path and taken a similar path. Maybe the Wilson brothers could have recorded together.
Yeah.
And that would have given us what we needed, because it was the DNA of that harmony
Yes.
that is at the core of what we love about the Beach Boys music. And Brian has shown he can take any voices, including 12 of his own, and make it sound like the Beach Boys. But you know, the Beatles broke up in 1970.
Yeah.
If the Beach Boys had broken up back then, Dennis might have gone off and had a career working with Daryl Dragon.
Yeah.
Who the heck knows? But you know, the family business kept them together. I see, you know, you got two family businesses on the wall behind you.
Yeah.
And good things don't necessarily come to family businesses that outlive their youthfulness and their usefulness.
Well, I also I marvel at most things about the Beach Boys and everything about the Beach Boys, but to think, and it's been said, and it was said in the Dennis Wilson BBC documentary about him, how no one was able to tell that Dennis Wilson would turn to such a prolific songwriter and lyricist on almost the same level as Brian. And you see what happened to Brian in the last 30 years of his own solo tour, and you say, what could have been with Dennis, but what can you say? You can't go back in time, unfortunately. We haven't mastered that scientific fact and ability yet.
For sure.
That you've also, as I mentioned in your intro, you worked with countless other acts, the Bee Gees, and you did stuff on Peter Sellers, Jonathan Winters, and the Brothers Marx, and some of the other ones. Your process for those, what varies from those projects, other outside Beach Boys products, to then Brian Wilson projects?
Well, the Brian Wilson projects, with the exception of the All-Star Tribute and A Beautiful Dreamer, have just kind of been my hobby, if you will. You know, the liner notes for the two-fers and the box sets, the Good Vibrations and Head Sound Sessions box set. Those are just great projects to work on.
Sure.
My career as a writer, director, producer has taken me down a lot of different roads. The first series of documentaries I did for the Disney Channel and PBS, I almost refer to those as kind of father and son programs.
Sure.
In the sense, when I was a kid, local television would show, on Sunday afternoons, they'd show Marx Brothers movies. And my father would say, oh, we got to watch these. You guys were the greatest. So we'd watch them with them. And so now I'm making a documentary about the Marx Brothers, and I'm trying to essentially create new fans.
Sure.
The way my father was when he was having us watch the movies with us. The lone exception in that era was the first Beatles project I did. You Can't Do That, the making of A Hard Day's Night, which was you know, as a Beatle fanatic, a Beatle maniac. You know, the Beatles are my number one group of all time. Sorry, everybody. From start to finish, there's so much joy in the work they did.
Sure.
Forget what's going on behind the scenes, because I didn't know what was going on behind the scenes with the Beach Boys either. There's just there doesn't seem to be a downward turn in their career. It's just like it goes like this and then it ends.
Sure.
So making a documentary on You Can't Do That on Hard Day's Night was just wonderful fun.
Sure.
And that's what introduced me into music documentary.
Okay.
And I did a lot of retrospective shows for PBS and other networks on specific legends from generations prior to mine, like Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Rosemary Clooney, etc. But in each one of those programs, there was a certain license where I was trying to figure out, how do I make this show interesting?
Sure.
How does the show play? because you don't just take 14 songs and string them together. What's the story that's going to be told? And I think, if anything, from the time I was little and making up lies as to why I hadn't done my homework, I've been a storyteller, and that's the skill, if you will, that I was able to apply to Brian on a grand scheme. But I remember when we went to meet with Jonathan Winters to discuss that program. That was, Jonathan Winters on the Loose, and if you think Robin Williams is great,
Yeah.
Jonathan Winters was Robin Williams' idol,
Yeah.
his mentor, his that's who he looked up to. And when we went to see him, he said to my former partner, he said, "What kind of show do you guys have in mind?" And I said to him, because what I'd love to do, he got real excited. He said, "What I'd love to do is go into town and go into different stores as different characters and have the camera follow me." And I said, "That's great. That's perfect. That's what we're going to do." But before we got to that, when he said, "What kind of a show do you guys have in mind?" my answer was, "What kind of a show would you like to do?"
Wow.
And because he said, "I've never been asked that question before." And I thought that was terribly sad.
Yeah.
That an artist at his level had always been constricted by network ideas of what Jonathan Winters should be.
Sure.
And so if you watch reruns of Mork and Mindy, you'll see Jonathan Winters and Robin Williams just explosively ad-libbing, which was what Jonathan Winters was greatest at. So to have a chance to have our camera follow him around ad-libbing was a thrill. Each one of those shows was a learning experience and getting more and more a sense of how do you make a show play for an hour or an hour and a half.
Sure.
That you can hold the audience. And that was, I worked on a lot of award shows, the Billboard Awards for 9 years. I worked on a number of tribute shows. Before I wrote and produced the Brian Wilson tribute, I'd worked on an Elvis tribute and a Christopher Reeve tribute. I later worked on an Ella Fitzgerald tribute. And it's, there are these great artists who, there's a story. What is the story that I thought the audience should learn? And that is probably the guiding force of everything I've done in my book, in my career, and in the book. What's the story I could tell the audience in this update that they would want to hear? That was kind of the conceit I bring to every project. And in this update, I really didn't want to dwell on the negativity that has surrounded the Beach Boys, Brian, the deaths and everything. I wasn't going to ignore it, but I really wanted to talk about all these celebratory moments.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot to talk about there.
The work, mentioning the outside Beach Boy Brian Wilson work you've done, and some of those, I mentioned John Lennon as well, and one on James Brown and Peter Sellers 3, I believe, at least the James Brown when he had died when you finished it. Was that the situation that he was gone after that?
Actually, James Brown died when we were in pre-production.
Oh, okay. So, and those then how do you, how much of a challenge, maybe not, I don't want to say excitable challenge, but a challenge in the sense of, okay, I have to tell a story now where the person who is about is not present to share their story, and it's just family members.
It's absolutely a challenge, and the key is to get people who can speak from an intimate point of view. With the John Lennon film, the story of the U.S. versus John Lennon was how the U.S. government was persecuting John Lennon, and Yoko Ono was there by his side. for the entire story. So the challenge was getting Yoko Ono to want to work with me, I'm a partner on this movie. And that was perhaps, I'm a pretty confident person. Um, as I write in the book, when I saw Dennis Wilson on the streets of Santa Monica, I didn't hesitate to go up to him and talk to him.
Yeah.
When I first met Mike Love, I didn't hesitate to start asking him questions. For whatever reason, I believe that I knew what I was talking about.
Sure.
So with going to see Yoko Ono, however, given her reputation,
Sure.
was a pretty scary moment to stand catty-cornered from the Dakota apartment building at Central Park West and realize I had to cross the spot where John Lennon had been murdered and go upstairs and convince her to make the movie. That was as intimidating a moment as I think I've had.
It's well, and not to mention someone who is a well-known and a big part of some of the greatest music of all time and part of the greatest moments of all time in music and in rock and roll. When you're not making documentaries or writing books, you're teaching at UCLA, you're teaching a course about the Beatles, but then a few other courses as well. What do those courses that you're teaching provide you that filmmaking and book writing do not provide to you?
It's a really smart question. I want to come back on this show again someday.
Okay.
So the first time I went into the classroom, keeping in mind that I was a really bad student when I was younger, I was a class clown.
Sure.
And there's nothing teachers hate more than the joker. First time I went into a classroom, and the course I taught, I named Docs That Rock, Docs That Rock. It was going to be about music documentaries. So I had the confidence that I was talking about a subject that I knew pretty well. But I found, it was like I found a home in the classroom, both talking about the work, but also talking to guys, and young men and women your age or younger, who were looking to me they were looking to me for help. Like, what are you going to teach us? And after I taught that course for a couple of years, I began a second course called Songwriters on Songwriting, with the longest subtitle in history: Killer Hooks, Essential Songs and Songwriters of the Rock Era, ... and those they've influenced. And I began bringing guests to all my classes so that I could talk to the students, not so much about how they did what they did. I'm sorry, I brought the guests to class to interview them, and the students would have a chance to talk to them as well. Not so much about how they did what they did, but to talk to them about their origin story. Because I found people's origin stories to be the most interesting, from the sense that once people are successful, it's pretty much, okay, they have a career, goes up and down and up and down. So what I could teach students was, this is how this person became an Academy Award-winning director. This is how this person became a Grammy-winning songwriter. This is how this person got involved with the Beatles. I teach a course called The Real Beatles, REEL, and I interview people who actually not only worked with the Beatles, but knew them before they were the Beatles. So it allows me to go into the past, to things that I'm interested in. And I think by sharing that passion with my students, they come for the ride with me.
Sure.
And they enjoy, even though most of the subject matter happened not only before they were born, but before their parents were born. I think I help bring it to life and make it relevant to today's times.
Well, and I'm sure it also gives you great pride in the fact that they may not be the next Bernie Taupins or or Tony Asher's or Brian Wilson's or Werner Herzog's, but you can instill in them the ability to know how to be successful in what it them to take and what it would take for them to be successful as well. Before we sort of say,
Did you read an article I wrote about this or something? Because that's exactly my goal, is to teach them how to be successful.
oh no, I think you might have mentioned in an interview where you're saying they're not going to be maybe big time lyricists, but to teach them other stuff is the goal of the class.
It is absolutely the goal, is because these are young men and women who got into UCLA, so they're already in the top,
Yeah,
0.1%. They're succeeding at UCLA.
yeah,
I'm helping to give them a sense of how to succeed in the real world.
sure.
And I'm sharing with them a lot of my own stories, successes and failures too.
Now, before we end here today, and again, I want to thank you for taking the time to do this. I have two little games I want to play with you at the end of this, if you're willing to do it. So this first one is sort of like a quick fire Brian Wilson thing. Well, I'll say, oh, your favorite this thing about Brian, and then you'll give your answer. The next one is a thing called the one-word challenge, which I'll explain better when we get there. So for this one, I'll ask you a few questions just about Brian from a general standpoint, and then you'll give your answer to it. So number one, your favorite collaborator of Brian's?
Tony Escher, Van Dyke Park's Tide.
Favorite deep cut of Brian's and or the Beach Boys?
Breakaway.
Okay. Besides Smile, your favorite Brian Wilson solo album?
Brian Wilson presents Smiles, Gershwin, Live at the Roxy.
And besides his music and his known sense of humor, your favorite quality he possesses?
He's really sweet. He's just such a kind person.
Sure.
He doesn't have a mean bone in his body.
That it seems as though he is that. In one moment that sticks out to me is I think it was the most recent concert I saw of him with my father, but then the all other ones as well, when he would sing God Only Knows, and he's gotten standing ovations, but see him at this stage of his career to get a standing ovation, to have his bandmates and Al Jardine and Blondie all bow down to him in a happy type of way, and have the crowd just stand there, him just having it soak in on him, and then him saying thank you is such a big deal. And he seems as though he's always been that type of humble. The next game I want to end as I got my paper.
By the way, I think part of that humbleness comes from him believing that he's a channel for God.
Sure.
That the music comes through him. So hey, I didn't really do it. I mean, he knows he did it, but he can't take all the credit. Won't take all the credit.
Well, exactly, as the Wilson brothers usually don't do. The last game I want to end with is called the One Word Challenge. So and this is my guest this week, David Leaf, is I'll throw a few names, places, people, or things that have some connection to my guest, and he'll have to do his best to say either a word or two or sentence. The best comes to mind when he hears it. So David, are you ready?
This is tough, but I am ready. Go ahead.
Westchester, New York.
Sal's Pizzeria.
Santa Monica, California.
The ocean.
Darian Sahanaja.
Greatness.
UCLA.
You want only one word?
One or two or a sentence, whatever comes to mind.
It's just a spectacularly special place.
Brian Wilson.
My hero, my friend. I wish him only peace and happiness, because he has given us so much joy with his art.
Exactly. We can only hope for that, especially after the last 60 years of him providing the best that he could. And last but certainly never least in this cosmic universe we live in, David Leaf.
Workaholic.
Well,
trying to breaking the habit with the help of my fiance.
Yes, and I hope now during these times after the book has come out, you give yourself a time to relax and breathe a little bit. Well, Mr. Leaf, I can't begin to express my gratitude for you to be humble enough and willing and open to share your stories about your book and other things revolving around Brian. This has been a true treat.
Thank you, Nolan. And I have to say before you sign off, I am extraordinarily impressed with both your preparation and the questions. This is really a a great conversation
Oh.
we've had. So I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate that. And, I know we had talked about making sure I put out the links for the book, which I certainly can. And if you want to promote that, the floor is yours, as they say.
Well, if you're watching, if you've come this far in the interview, God only knows the story of Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, and the California Myth is out September 22nd. Nolan is going to post an Amazon link where you can buy it. I'm also I'm working on putting together kind of a VIP experience of the book, which I'll be announcing on my Facebook page sometime before the book actually comes out,
Right.
which will involve a personally autographed, numbered, and limited edition of the book. There've been a lot of questions as how to get a signed copy.
Sure.
I just want people to buy the book from Amazon or your local bookstore, even better,
Yeah.
and read it. And I hope people feel they get their money's worth, because I like to think of it as two books in one. It has the original book and then the update, which is more than half the length of the original book.
Sure.
So there's a lot to read, a lot to absorb. I know that in writing the update, the first thing I did was read the original edition and the 1985 update, and it's intense.
Sure.
It's not breezy.
Sure.
So I tried to make the update a little easier to read, because the last 30-something years with Brian have been easier.
Sure.
He hasn't had quite the pain and suffering. But it's a privilege to be on the show. It's a privilege to write about Brian. I think I've written more words about him than anybody else alive at this point. I feel like in many ways that I started on this mission 50 years ago, and this book, the original edition, was a big step in the mission. But now it feels like, with the book finally getting out into the world, the mission of me as a writer about Brian, it feels complete at this point.
Well, I'm eagerly waiting for a hard copy when it comes out in September, at the middle of September. I have the Amazon version, so I'll be looking forward to purchasing when it is available. If you like what you watch, because who the heck wouldn't? And down the road, when my guest this week wins another award for either his written work or his documentary film work, you'll say, "Holy crap! I should have subscribed, followed, shared, all that fun jazz." Then follow on Instagram, Nolan Cart Night Show, on Twitter, Nolan Cart Night. And in the words of the Dean of Talk Show, Johnny Carson, I bid you all a heartfelt good night. Till next time, take care and thank you.